8 consecutive Mr. Olympia wins, unbeaten, uninjured, and somehow totally overlooked. How do you win more Olympias in a row than anyone in history and become the guy nobody talks about? The answer isn't a cover-up. It isn't a grudge. It's something structural, built into the sport's DNA, and in some ways, more damning than either of those things. Lee Haney won the Mr. Olympia in 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, and 1991. 8 consecutive titles. He retired at 31, undefeated, holding a record that stood alone for 14 years. No one in the history of competitive bodybuilding had ever won more Olympias in a row. Not Arnold Schwarzenegger, who won 7 total across 2 separate runs. Not Dorian Yates, who won 6. Nobody. When Ronnie Coleman finally tied the record with his 8th consecutive win in 2005, his first public statement was this: "It's a great honor to be up there with Lee Haney. Now we both have 8. I've always considered him to be the greatest." A man who had just matched the record called the record holder the greatest. And still, Lee Haney is the guy we don't hear much about. Before this becomes a complaint, put the wins on the table, fast. Haney walked into the 1984 Mr. Olympia in New York City at 24 years old, weighing 243 pounds, and dethroned reigning champion Samir Bannout. He was the second youngest winner in the contest's history, after Arnold. He came back in 1985 and won in Belgium. In 1986, he did something no competitor had ever done in the contest's entire history. He received 2 perfect scores from the judging panel, the first time that had happened in the sport. Then 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991. 8 straight. Across his entire career, 16 professional shows, he never placed lower than 3rd. Not once. His physical profile helps frame the dominance. 5'11", competition weight of 243 pounds at his first Olympia, and 248 at his last, his heaviest. 20-inch arms on a 31-inch waist. The sport described his shape as the X-frame. Maximum width at the shoulders and back, maximum taper at the waist. A silhouette that combined mass with proportion in a way that judges then and now describe as a paradigm the physique should aspire to. He was bigger than most of his competition, while carrying the symmetry of a smaller competitor. One magazine would later describe his era-defining physique as a paradigm of mass that represented the ideal of size with shapeliness, a standard that, for 8 consecutive years, no one could match. The men he beat weren't weak fields. Rich Gaspari, described as a 3-time Olympia runner-up, trained with Haney the same year Haney took his first title. Lee Labrada, a 185-pound competitor with a conditioning level that arguably pushed Haney harder than anyone else, came second multiple times. Dorian Yates finished second to Haney at the 1991 Olympia, and then went on to win 6 Olympias himself. The men Lee Haney defeated were world-class athletes who would have dominated any other era. He just dominated them first. And here's the impossibility this story is built on. The man who compiled that record is the answer to a trivia question. So this isn't a biography, this is a prosecution. The defendant isn't Lee Haney, it's the sport's broken relationship with legacy. Bodybuilding has never had a neutral media infrastructure. From the late 1960s through Haney's entire competitive career, the dominant platform for the sport was Joe and Ben Weider's publishing empire, Flex Magazine, Muscle and Fitness, and a constellation of related titles. The Weider brothers co-founded the IFBB, and their magazines didn't just cover the sport, they defined it, amplified who they chose to amplify, and constructed the narratives that fans absorbed as history. In the pre-internet era, the Weider publications were the sport's only storytelling infrastructure. One academic study described them as sitting at the core of bodybuilding's entire media structure, not as independent observers of the sport, but as its primary architects. The magazines functioned, in effect, as both the rulebook and the press corps. And that infrastructure ran on product. It ran on personalities. What moved product, then as now, wasn't sustained excellence. It was story, drama, conflict, transformation. The kind of content that made a reader pick up next month's issue to find out what happened next. No named editor ever confirmed on record that Weider's publications ran a deliberate policy of preferring controversy over clean dominance. What the record shows is the structure. a media machine built around personality-driven narratives, operating in a sport where the most celebrated champion of the previous generation had been, above all else, a performer. Lee Haney gave that machine almost nothing to work with. That's Exhibit 1. There was nothing. No drug allegations, no public feuds, no personal scandals, no legally contested judging decisions. Barben described him as the epitome of how the sport should be represented both on stage and off. That's not a posthumous tribute. That's what people said while he was still competing. Fans writing about him decades later would put it simply. Sadly, we don't hear much about Lee because he was a class act guy. Not much controversy around him. That sentence carries genuine admiration. It also describes precisely why the legacy machine had nowhere to put him. A class act with no controversy earns respect. Respect doesn't compound the way controversy does. Compare what surrounded him. Arnold Schwarzenegger entered the 1980 Mr. Olympia with 1 day's notice, won, and sparked a controversy the sport still debates. Steroid admissions, personal scandals that emerged years later and refreshed his name in the discourse each time. Each episode was content. Dorian Yates admitted to steroid use and trained in methods so extreme they repeatedly tore his body apart. And those injuries, recoveries, and admissions generated media cycles of their own. Ronnie Coleman's extreme training era produced its own ongoing spectacle. Every one of those champions gave the machine something to sell beyond the trophy. Haney gave it 8 trophies and nothing else. Exhibit 2. Timing. Arnold Schwarzenegger's bodybuilding dominance ended in 1975 with his controversial 1980 comeback. But Arnold didn't disappear when he stopped competing. He got larger. The documentary Pumping Iron came out in 1977 and introduced him to mainstream audiences who had never attended a bodybuilding competition. The film was partially staged, scenes dramatized for narrative effect, psychological warfare constructed for the camera. But the staging worked, and it turned Arnold from a champion into a mythology. Academic studies on his career documented fierce self-promotion and a calculated approach to public image that he deployed across every phase of his life. No one before or after him, in bodybuilding specifically, has achieved the same level of name recognition. And the reason isn't athletic achievement alone, it's media behavior. By 1984, the year Haney won his first title, Arnold was starring in The Terminator. By 1987, Predator. By 1990, Total Recall. His film career ran parallel to Haney's entire Olympia reign, keeping the Arnold-era mythology alive and growing at exactly the moment Haney was building his record. Every journalist who wanted to write about bodybuilding for a mainstream audience had an easier hook. The man who did this went on to do that. The sport's biggest crossover moment was being generated by someone who had retired from competition before Haney ever entered it. Arnold also had a manufactured rivalry that the media could narrate. His psychological maneuvering against Lou Ferrigno, captured on film, became the central drama of Pumping Iron and remains one of the most referenced scenes in the sport's history. His earlier rivalry with Sergio Oliva is still described as one of the most contested in Olympia history. Both rivalries were content. Both extended his name through decades of debate that his actual wins alone wouldn't have sustained. Haney's closest equivalent was Lee Labrada, and the Labrada rivalry, though genuinely competitive, was low drama. Labrada was gracious. Haney was gracious. There was no filmed psychological warfare, no public antagonism, no moment that became a scene people quote from memory. Two excellent competitors who respected each other, produced excellent competition, and very little media friction. Then, the moment Haney retired, came Dorian Yates. Yates had finished second to Haney at the 1991 Olympia. He won in Helsinki in 1992, and the sport immediately reorganized its self-narrative around him. Academic literature describes Yates as generally considered to be the first mass monster, the competitor who heralded a new era. He arrived at a conditioning level the competitive field had never produced, and his physique was described as the antithesis of the more aesthetic-oriented bodybuilders who had preceded him. The community processed his 1992 win as a categorical break. The year bodybuilding would never be the same again. The sport's perpetual need for the next extreme did what it always does. It made the previous extreme look moderate in retrospect, and made the era that produced it feel like a prelude rather than a peak. Haney's era had no pumping iron, no mainstream crossover, no cultural penetration that embedded his name beyond the sport's own audience. When it ended into the gap between two dominant narratives. Arnold's era had mythology. Dorian's era had revolution. Haney's era had 8 consecutive wins, which turned out to be insufficient raw material to generate either. The record sat in the gap. Exhibit 3 is a philosophy. 6 words. Exercise to stimulate, not to annihilate. That's Lee Haney's most widely cited line, attributed to him across dozens of independent sources, a training principle so thoroughly associated with him that fellow competitor Sean Ray was still invoking it years later. Lee Haney said, "Stimulate, don't annihilate. That's what bodybuilding is. You have to stimulate the muscle, not try to kill it." It's a genuinely good philosophy. It also produced no compelling media narrative. Haney trained with controlled form, intelligent programming, and structured recovery. He had an ESPN workout show in 1989 and 1990 that spread the message to gym-goers around the country. He believed that the world wasn't formed in a day, and neither were we. The principle was specifically designed to prevent the outcome that makes for the most dramatic bodybuilding content: the injury, the near destruction, the ruin and resurrection arc. Because Haney never destroyed himself, there was no rebuilding story to tell. He peaked on schedule, won on schedule, and retired healthy. The drama of his training life was the absence of drama. Ronnie Coleman deadlifting 800 pounds while screaming in the gym was content. Dorian Yates training to the point of serious muscle tears was content. His admissions about his methods and their cost generated entire media cycles. Lee Haney training with controlled form and proper recovery was good advice for a Saturday morning television show. All 3 approaches produced Olympia champions. Only 2 of them generated narratives that the sport's media infrastructure could sell. There is something worth saying clearly here. Haney was right. The philosophy was correct. But correct and compelling are different markets, and bodybuilding has always served the second one. Exhibit 4 is the most important one, and the most quietly devastating. Lee Haney has said on record, "I've always looked at bodybuilding as my job. It wasn't my idol." That sentence is the key to understanding what happened to his legacy. 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, the most consecutive wins in the history of the sport. And the man holding the record describes it as a job, not a calling, not an obsession, a job. A completed one at that, because his stated reason for retiring in 1991 was that he had accomplished all of his goals. His final goal was to set the record. He set it, he left. No comeback attempt, no public campaign for recognition. He transitioned into Christian ministry through the Harvest House Foundation. He founded a gym chain, Lee Haney's Animal Kingdom, later renamed Lee's World Class Fitness Centers. He authored 3 books. He served as chairman of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports under President Bill Clinton from 1999 to 2002. He launched the Lee Haney Games, a classic bodybuilding competition that continues today. He built a full, purposeful life outside the sport, and from all available evidence, didn't spend that life bitter about his standing in the bodybuilding conversation. That contentment is admirable. For the purposes of legacy building, it's close to fatal. Legacy doesn't sustain itself. It requires curation. The champion staying embedded in the conversation through comeback stories, public friction, the kind of ongoing media presence that keeps a name circulating. Arnold spent decades doing exactly that, through films, through a governor's race, through controversies that emerged in new decades and refreshed his name each time. Every new chapter generated new coverage that retroactively amplified the bodybuilding legacy at its root. Haney described his 8 Olympia titles as a job, did the job excellently, and went home. The sport that runs on the drama of its athletes had no mechanism to honor someone who refused to perform drama. He also never idolized the sport that largely forgot him, which is either the most dignified response imaginable or the confirmation that the media machine was right to doubt his marketability. depending on your perspective. Either way, the result is the same: total dominance, visible absence. Now, there's one moment in Haney's career that came closest to generating the controversy the legacy machine craves. September 15th, 1990. Aerie Crown Theater, Chicago. The first and only drug-tested Mr. Olympia in history. The testing program was initiated by Joe and Ben Weider, not by the IFBB as an independent body, and the motivations were external. The 1988 Ben Johnson doping scandal at the Seoul Olympics had put performance-enhancing drugs on front pages worldwide. The 1990 Anabolic Steroids Control Act was passing through Congress. Ben Weider's long-standing push for Olympic recognition of bodybuilding required demonstrating that the sport could meet IOC standards. Urine samples were collected 3 days before the September 15th event. 20 competitors entered. 5 were disqualified before the competition began. Mohammed Benaziza, Barry DeMay, J.J. Marsh, Van Walcott Smith, and Vince Comerford. A quarter of the competitive field was gone. Lee Haney competed, passed, won his 7th consecutive title. The fact that Haney passed the sport's only drug test didn't generate the kind of lasting narrative spike you might expect. It validated his reputation, rather than creating a talking point. He won clean in a tested field. That's a good fact. It's not a drama. It's a confirmation of the story that already existed. But the real debate that year centered on Lee Labrada. Labrada was the most credible challenger of the Haney era. Compact where Haney was massive, with a conditioning level that repeatedly placed him second and occasionally pushed the scoring closer than the results suggested. In the 1989 Olympia prejudging, Labrada had outscored Haney, the only competitor to outscore the champion in prejudging across his entire run from 1984 onward. That's not a fan's claim. That's Iron Man magazine's documented account of the 1989 results. Then, in 1990, Labrada returned to the drug-tested Olympia, focused entirely on the championship, reportedly in the best condition of his competitive career. The contest was close enough that the question of whether Labrada should have won has never been cleanly resolved. Today, YouTube videos ask, was Lee Labrada robbed at the 1990 Mr. Olympia? And they generate genuine debate, not because the question has a clear answer, but because it doesn't. What no published source provides is confirmed scoring data from that day. No official point margins, no breakdown that settles the result one way or the other. The debate exists in the community, not in the record books. Labrada's own public comments about those years focused on the inadequacy of the testing protocol. He subtly made clear that the 5 who failed weren't representative of who was or wasn't using across the entire field. His point was about the integrity of the testing system, not about whether he had been robbed by the judges. He wasn't claiming the trophy. Then the IFBB abandoned drug testing entirely the following year, reversing the policy amid spectator criticism. The 1990 Olympia became a historical footnote, remembered more for who wasn't on stage than for who won it. The one testing experiment the sport ever ran in the open division lasted exactly 1 year, which means the one context in which Haney's clean record could have been formally and comparatively validated was removed from the structure before it could mean anything. Here is what this section points toward. Even in the one moment that had genuine controversy surrounding it, Lee Haney remained personally controversy-free. The drama was about the testing protocol, about who failed, about whether the field was representative. Nothing about Haney's conduct, nothing about any disputed judging decision in his favor. Nothing he said or did generated a lasting negative narrative. He won. He passed. He was already thinking about 1991. Even when controversy was in the room, it couldn't attach to him. Haney won his 8th and final title in Orlando in 1991 and retired. 1 year later, Dorian Yates walked on stage in Helsinki, and the sport's historical memory reorganized around him. The framing was immediate and categorical. Before Dorian, bodybuilding had been about aesthetics and symmetry. After Dorian, it was about mass. That transition was real. Yates's physique was categorically different from anything the Olympia stage had seen. But the narrative framing reduced 8 years of clean dominance to what bodybuilding looked like before things got serious. By 1998, when Ronnie Coleman began his own 8-title run, the mass monster standard had been normalized, and Haney's aesthetic era was doubly buried, first by Dorian's mass revolution, then by Coleman's extreme size epoch. Haney existed between two narratives the sport found more compelling: the bridge between Arnold's mythology and Dorian's revolution, not the subject of either story. Then Coleman tied the record in 2005 and said the quiet part out loud: "I've always considered him to be the greatest." And the conversation moved on anyway. Here is the closing argument, and it requires honesty first. In 2025, Lee Haney publicly revealed he needs a kidney transplant. His children confirmed the seriousness of the situation, and multiple outlets reported it directly. That fact belongs in the story. Leaving it out would turn a complicated reality into a cleaner argument than the evidence supports. What the available reporting does not establish is any connection between Haney's kidney condition and his competitive career. The sources don't support that claim, and making it would be speculation. What the evidence does support, with no speculation required, is this: Lee Haney is alive and fighting in his mid-60s. In the context of the sport he competed in and the eras that followed him, that statement carries more weight than it might appear to. By the time the sport's mass monster era was generating headlines about extreme health costs, Haney had been retired for 6 years. He was running his gym chain and writing his books. Haney himself has spoken about this directly and publicly. He has said that deaths are on the rise at early ages in professional bodybuilding. He has named Sean Roden and George Peterson and Dallas McCarver when discussing what the sport's mass at all costs era has produced. He has said, "Today's pro bodybuilding is all about mass at all costs," and "Bodybuilding has lost its way and appeal to the general population." This isn't a retired champion complaining from the sidelines. It's the sport's clean record holder, watching the eras that followed him generate exactly the kind of body count his philosophy was designed to avoid. The community has noted what the statistics suggest. Competitors didn't seem to start dropping at early ages until the modern mass monster era arrived. That's an observation, not a peer-reviewed finding, but the data points accumulate in one direction. The Haney era ended in 1991. The sport has buried others since. Haney is 66, still publicly engaged, still running the Lee Haney Games, the classic bodybuilding competition he founded as a vehicle for the aesthetic standard he represented. Still commenting on current events in the sport, still relevant enough that his view on the 2025 Mr. Olympia results drew public attention. Here is what this entire argument has been building toward. Bodybuilding's attention economy had no use for Lee Haney because it runs on drama, and he wouldn't supply any. No feuds, no scandals, no manufactured rivalry, no extremity that required a recovery arc, no desperate comeback, no public campaign to reclaim recognition he felt he'd been denied. He described 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles as a job. He did the job, he left. The media machine was busy building mythology around the era that preceded his, and revolution around the era that followed it. And Haney, sandwiched between both, compiled the most dominant consecutive Olympia record in the sport's history without ever giving the machine a handle to carry him with. The men who got the lasting fame gave the machine what it needed. Some of them paid for that fame in ways that Haney didn't, with injuries that ended careers before the careers should have ended, with health costs that compounded for decades, with bodies that the mass at all costs doctrine wore down past the point of recovery. The champions the sport found most compelling were, in too many cases, the ones the sport's demands consumed. Lee Haney, meanwhile, is still here, still standing, still fighting his own health battle, which is real and serious, and not connected to his training philosophy by any available evidence. Still built the way a 66-year-old who trained to stimulate, not annihilate, tends to be built. 8 Olympias, no career-ending injuries, no feuds, no scandal, no desperate comeback, and 4 decades after his first title, still active, still standing, still the name Ronnie Coleman invoked when he wanted to describe what greatness looked like. The sport forgot Lee Haney. He doesn't appear to have forgotten himself. Subscribe for more stories like this.